Welcome, weary traveler, to a quiet journey into the very heart of one of history's most profound and terrifying trials. Tonight, we will immerse ourselves entirely in the experience of the Black Death, seeking not the grand battles or the celebrated figures, but the intimate, visceral reality of daily life for the ordinary people who found themselves caught in its relentless grip. Let the details of this extraordinary historical period wash over you as we delve deeply into what it was really like to survive the Black Death designed for your deepest rest. For the next 2 hours, we will explore the nuances of survival, the slow psychological erosion, the desperate choices, and the quiet, unending fear that permeated every moment. We will delve into the sights, the sounds, and, perhaps most unforgettably, the pervasive smells of a world transformed by an invisible enemy. Lay back, find your most comfortable position, and allow your mind to drift back to the mid-14th century. Before the darkness, there was light and life in abundance. To truly understand the impact of the Black Death, we must first gently immerse ourselves in the world that existed just before its arrival. Their lives were inextricably linked to the land, dictated by the turning of the seasons. From dawn, the quiet clatter of wooden shoes on packed earth, the lowing of cattle, the distant bleating of sheep, merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers moved across the continent, carrying goods, ideas, and, unbeknownst to them, the seeds of destruction. The bustling ports of Venice, Genoa, Marseille, and London were vibrant hubs where cultures met, and goods from distant lands exchanged hands. Caravans crossed vast distances, ships plied the seas, connecting distant realms. It was along these very routes, from the heart of Asia, that the silent, unseen enemy would begin its inexorable journey, plowing the fields with oxen, broadcasting seeds by hand, the relentless weeding under the summer sun, and the communal effort of harvest. Previous, smaller outbreaks of disease were not uncommon, but none prepared them for what was to come. As we settle into the quiet hum of this pre-plague world, imagine the unawareness, the continued rhythm of planting and harvesting, of buying and selling, of praying and living. A world vibrant, complex, and utterly unsuspecting of the catastrophe that was already sailing towards its shores. The peaceful ignorance before the storm, the smell of freshly turned earth, of wood smoke from simple hearths, the scent of wildflowers in the meadows, and the comforting aroma of cooking gruel or bread. Their lives were hard, marked by physical labor, but they possessed a profound connection to the soil and the cycles of nature. Each year brought the promise or the dread of the harvest. Imagine Europe in the early to mid-14th century, a continent teeming with life, recovering from earlier famines, and bustling with activity. Consider the rhythms of daily life for the vast majority of people. The peasants, at its peak, sat the king, then the great lords, followed by knights, and then the vast pyramid of the peasantry. Each person had a place, a duty, a role defined by birth and tradition. The church, too, was a pervasive presence, its spires dominating every skyline, its rituals marking every stage of life from birth to death. Faith was not just belief, it was the framework of existence, offering comfort, explanation, and a strict moral code. Sermons from the pulpit, the chanting of monks, the quiet prayers in humble homes, these were the constant companions of the medieval soul. Now, shift your focus to the towns and cities, the burgeoning centers of trade and craft. Picture the narrow, winding streets, often unpaved and muddy, the cacophony of sounds, the calls of hawkers selling their wares, fresh fish, hot pies, fine cloth, the clatter of carts on cobblestones, the ringing of church bells marking the hours, the incessant chatter of crowds. The air would have been thick with a mix of odors, the metallic temps from the blacksmith's forge, the pungent smell of tanneries, the sweet scent of bakeries, and often the less pleasant effluvium of human and animal waste. Life here was faster, more diverse, but also more crowded, more prone to the spread of rumor and, crucially, disease. Consider the social structures that bound this world together. The feudal system, travel and trade, though slow by modern standards, were the arteries of this world. There had been warning signs, of course. Earlier famines, like the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, had already weakened populations. The first whispers were carried on the sea breeze from distant lands across the Black Sea. Reports spoke of a terrible sickness spreading through the Mongol Empire, then to the Silk Road cities, through Persia, and finally into the Middle East. A Genoese trading ship, arriving from the Crimea, sailed into the harbor. Many aboard were already dead, their bodies covered in black swellings. Those few who were still alive were gravely ill. The authorities tried to turn the ship away, but it was too late. These were caused by internal bleeding, giving the disease its chilling, enduring name, the Black Death. Imagine the shock, the disbelief, as a seemingly healthy neighbor, friend, or family member would succumb in such a short span. There was no time for wakes, no opportunity for the full procession, the careful preparation of the body, or simply to wait for one's own inevitable end. The usual rhythms of communal life, of comfort in shared sorrow, were utterly disrupted by the overwhelming, brutal efficiency of the plague. It was a time when the future seemed to vanish, replaced by the crushing weight of the immediate, terrifying present. There was little time for goodbyes, no drawn-out farewells. Life was vibrant one moment, extinguished the next, leaving behind a bewildered and terrified silence, a horrifying discoloration that signaled the body's final, desperate struggle. The invisible passenger had disembarked. From Messina, it began its relentless march across the continent. They were just stories at first, tales of unimaginable death, too far away to truly comprehend. But then the stories found faces and ships. It arrived in Europe in October of 1347, likely at Messina, Sicily. Imagine, with a quiet dread, the moment the symptoms first appeared in your village, your town. It often began subtly, a deceptive prelude to agony. These were the terrifying, unmistakable hallmarks of the plague. Painful, angry swellings, most commonly in the groin, armpit, or neck. Picture them, a hot, throbbing lump, growing rapidly, perhaps to the size of a pigeon's egg, or even as large as an apple. The pain would have been excruciating, a constant, burning agony that no poultice or prayer could alleviate. These buboes were the outward manifestation of the disease, the lymph nodes overwhelmed by bacteria. These could easily be dismissed as the common fevers and ailments of medieval life. Perhaps you'd simply feel too tired to rise from your straw mattress, or too weak to lift your tools. But then the buboes would appear. And then, as the disease progressed, the skin would often begin to show dark, purplish, or black spots. The speed of the disease was terrifying. For most, once these characteristic symptoms appeared, death was swift, often within a mere 2 to 5 days. This rapidity of death meant that traditional mourning rituals, so vital to medieval society, began to collapse. As the plague tightened its grip, the very atmosphere of daily life transformed into a nightmare of sensory overload and social collapse. Of all the horrors, perhaps none was as pervasive, as inescapable, as the smell of death. Imagine the streets, once bustling, becoming eerily quiet save for the creak of burial carts. Markets closed, not for lack of goods, but for lack of buyers and sellers, or out of fear. Craftsmen abandoned their workshops, fields lay untended. Some, gripped by religious fervor, turned to extreme penitence, joining processions of flagellants who publicly whipped themselves, believing that by atoning for sins they could appease a wrathful God who had sent the plague as punishment. These very gatherings, ironically, often served to spread the disease further, turning acts of faith into vectors of death. Law enforcement often crumbled as magistrates and guards themselves fell ill or fled. There was little authority left, only desperation. The sheer effort was immense, and the dangers to the gravediggers themselves constant. Accounts from chroniclers speak of carts piled high with corpses passing through streets, the bell tolling almost ceaselessly, or entire families found dead in their homes, untouched for days or weeks. The normal cycle of life and death, of communal mourning and respectful burial, was utterly obliterated by the plague's relentless pace. The living were too busy surviving, or burying, or simply waiting for their own inevitable end. This was a world reduced to its starkest, most brutal elements. Close your eyes and try to conjure it with a quiet dread. Driven by overwhelming terror of contagion, families, once bound by deep ties of kinship and love, might turn on each other. A sick child might be left alone, an ailing parent might be shunned. The instinct for self-preservation, primal and absolute, often overrode compassion. Not just the scent of one corpse, but hundreds, thousands, piled in homes, in pits, in alleys. Misguided cures and superstitious practices became rampant. Physicians, those few who hadn't already succumbed, donned their famous plague doctor costumes, long leather coats, and bird-like masks with beaks filled with aromatic herbs. Believing this would filter out the bad air or miasma they thought caused the disease. These figures, with their haunting appearance, became symbols of both futile hope and grim reality. The cloying, sickeningly sweet odor of decaying flesh, mingling with the stench of sickness, unwashed bodies, and human waste, would have hung heavy in the air. It permeated everything: clothing, homes, food, the very air one breathed. There was no escaping it. It was a constant, tangible reminder of the unseen enemy that stalked every street, every door. This omnipresent odor was a psychological torment in itself, a constant reinforcement of the surrounding despair. The sheer volume of death led to an unimaginable breakdown of normal life and social order. The most agonizing aspect was often the abandonment of the sick. In this climate of panic, people turned to whatever desperate measures they could conceive. Imagine the profound trauma of witnessing such widespread death, the loss of entire families, the disappearance of neighbors, the silence where once there was laughter and life. Grief became a constant, pervasive companion. But it was a grief without the usual outlets, a grief too immense to be fully processed. Lords, desperate to keep their lands productive, were forced to offer better terms, could not withstand the fundamental shift in the balance of power between lords and laborers. Their struggles, their fears, and their unwitting role in shaping the future of a continent remind us that even from the deepest despair, and in the quiet aftermath of immense suffering, the course of history can be irrevocably, and sometimes surprisingly, altered. The Black Death was not just a medical event, it was a profound human experience, whose echoes resonate quietly even today. A monetized economy and the gradual emergence of a more modern social structure, more favorable tenancy agreements, and, crucially, new opportunities for serfs to gain their freedom. Imagine a peasant, previously tied to the land, now able to negotiate for better conditions, or even leave their manor to seek more lucrative opportunities in a town or on another estate. Survivors often struggled with guilt. Why had they lived when so many others, perhaps more virtuous, had perished? Every cough, every fever, every swelling would trigger a fresh wave of terror. People lived with an acute awareness of their own mortality, a fragility that had been brutally exposed. This led to a deep questioning of faith. If God was just, why had he unleashed such a horror? Why had prayers gone unanswered? The fear of recurrence was ever present. The plague did not disappear entirely. It became endemic, flaring up in localized outbreaks for centuries afterwards. The sheer scale of population loss meant that labor, previously abundant and cheap, became scarce, and therefore incredibly valuable. Imagine the shock for landlords, accustomed to a ready supply of serfs. For the surviving peasantry, this scarcity of labor often translated into surprising, if hard-won, advantages. It inadvertently acted as a powerful catalyst for the decline of feudalism in many parts of Western Europe. As our journey through this grim chapter of history draws to a close, reflect on the silent fortitude of those who endured. To truly appreciate the genius of Giovanni Boccaccio and the enduring power of the Decameron, we must first establish the vibrant canvas upon which his life unfolded. Our journey begins in Florence, not yet ravaged by plague, but flourishing as a crucible of Renaissance thought, commerce, and art in the early to mid-14th century. Imagine Florence, a city of bustling markets, magnificent cathedrals like the Santa Maria del Fiore, its dome not yet complete, but its ambition already palpable. Picture the narrow streets, alive with the sounds of merchants hawking their wares, fine silks, spices from the East, luxurious furs. This was a time when humanism was beginning to take root, a philosophical movement that emphasized human potential, classical learning. His initial works often explored themes of love, courtly life, and classical mythology, reflecting the romantic and humanist ideals of his time. He was not yet the chronicler of the plague, but a scholar preparing his mind, honing his craft, absorbing the beauty and complexity of the world around him. He lived in a city on the cusp of artistic and intellectual revolution, a place that, despite its advancements, remained vulnerable to the forces of nature. Unaware of the profound challenge that was about to descend upon its bustling streets and vibrant intellectual life. The quiet hum of prosperity and scholarly pursuit filled the air, soon to be replaced by a chilling silence. He devoured ancient texts, meticulously copying and studying them, helping to preserve the very works that would inspire generations of scholars and artists. He was a keen observer of human nature, a witty conversationalist, and a man deeply immersed in the cultural currents of his age. Boccaccio became a close friend and intellectual companion to none other than Francesco Petrarch, one of the earliest and most influential humanists. Their correspondence and shared passion for classical texts fueled Boccaccio's own literary ambitions. Though his father was a successful merchant and banker, he spent several formative years in Naples, a city known for its vibrant court culture and intellectual pursuits, a place where he was exposed to classical learning and the rich traditions of storytelling. Here, he experienced a life far removed from the strictures of Florentine mercantile life, cultivating a love for literature and poetry that would ultimately define his path. The air would have carried the scent of leather, of freshly baked bread, and the subtle aroma of olive oil and wine. This was a city where wealth was accumulating, not just in the hands of old nobility, but in the burgeoning merchant and banking families who would become the patrons of the coming Renaissance. It was into this dynamic and intellectually fertile environment that Giovanni Boccaccio was born in 1313. His early life was somewhat unconventional. Returning to Florence, Boccaccio found himself drawn into the city's burgeoning intellectual circles. He composed poetry, narrative poems, and early prose works. Imagine him in a quiet Florentine study, perhaps by candlelight, a quill scratching softly on parchment. The vibrant energy of Florence, the intellectual ferment, the daily rhythms of trade and craft, all were violently interrupted in the spring of 1348, the Black Death, which had been creeping across Europe since late 1347, reached the prosperous heart of Tuscany with devastating speed and ferocity. He saw the first subtle changes, fewer people in the piazza, a growing sense of unease. Then the undeniable signs, the rapid appearance of buboes, the black spots, the swift, inescapable demise. He witnessed firsthand the breakdown of the city's meticulously ordered society. His motivation was not solely to entertain, though entertainment was certainly part of it. It was a more profound, almost defiant act of creation. He sought to create a monument to life, wit, and humanity in the very shadow of death. He understood that while the body might perish, the human spirit, its capacity for storytelling, for love, for laughter, and for reflection, could endure. Giovanni Boccaccio, the scholar and observer, found himself a direct witness to its unspeakable horrors. It was a way for Boccaccio to process the unspeakable horrors he had witnessed, to find order in chaos, and to remind himself and his readers of the enduring richness of human experience, even when surrounded by death. He understood that in a world stripped bare by plague, the human voice, telling a tale, offered a vital connection, a momentary escape, and a powerful reaffirmation of existence. He described the desperate attempts to understand and combat the disease, the frantic burning of herbs, the desperate prayers, the utterly futile medical treatments. He imagined a retreat, an escape from the infected city, a microcosm of hope and normalcy amidst the widespread death. This was not a flight of cowardice, but a strategic withdrawal, an attempt to preserve life and sanity, and to find solace in the shared act of narration. The idea was simple, yet profound, to create a space, both physical and literary, where human stories could continue to flourish, even as the world outside crumbled. He detailed the collapse of civic authority, the abandonment of the sick by their own families, the shocking sight of bodies left untended in homes and on the streets. Imagine him walking through the very streets he had once described with such affection, now transformed into a landscape of fear and death. Others embracing a fatalistic eat, drink, and be merry attitude, indulged in excess, believing their end was inevitable regardless of their actions. He observed the grim necessity of mass burials, the overflowing cemeteries, and the quiet horror of those whose task it was to collect and dispose of the dead. The traditional markers of human life, birth, marriage, death, lost their meaning in the face of such overwhelming, indiscriminate annihilation. The city, once teeming with life, became a quiet, mournful shadow of its former self, filled with the pervasive, sickly sweet stench of death. Boccaccio chronicled these observations in the magnificent preface to the Decameron, a preface that serves as one of the most vivid and chilling historical accounts of the plague. He wrote of the shift in human behavior. Some, in a desperate attempt to avoid contagion, became hermits, isolating themselves entirely. It was amidst this profound devastation, this palpable sense of loss and despair, that Boccaccio conceived the Decameron. The very act of writing the Decameron became a form of psychological survival. The ingenious framework he devised for the stories was itself a response to the plague. Having witnessed the raw terror of the plague in Florence, Boccaccio, through his narrative, offers us a quiet sanctuary, a beautiful, secluded villa nestled in the hills outside the city. It is here that the Decameron's narrative framework truly comes alive. Imagine this setting, a serene escape from the ravaged world, with lush gardens, fragrant flowers, and the distant, muffled sounds of a nature undisturbed by human suffering. Each day a king or queen is chosen who sets a theme for the day's stories, perhaps love that had a tragic ending. They range from the hilariously bawdy and irreverent, poking fun at greedy clergy, foolish husbands, and cunning lovers, to deeply tragic narratives of misfortune and heartwarming tales of unwavering loyalty and virtue. He subtly, and sometimes not so subtly, critiques the corruption within the church, the hypocrisy of certain social classes, and the prevailing societal norms. Unlike much of medieval literature that focused almost exclusively on the divine and the afterlife, Boccaccio's stories are firmly rooted in the here and now. They explore the complexities of human relationships, the pursuit of happiness, and the consequences of moral choices in a secular context. Even amidst the backdrop of profound religious crisis brought by the plague, the stories champion human agency, ingenuity, and the pursuit of joy. He celebrates wit, intelligence, and ingenuity as essential tools for navigating the often treacherous waters of human interaction. The listeners are absorbed, forgetting, if only for a moment, the horrors beyond their walls. These tales became a shield against despair, a reaffirmation of the richness and diversity of life, a quiet act of defiance against the silence of death. Boccaccio created a literary space where wit, cleverness, and the sheer joy of narrative could thrive, even when the world outside was crumbling. It is a testament to the enduring power of storytelling to heal, to entertain, and to preserve the very essence of humanity. The characters in his stories, whether noble or common, are driven by passions, desires, and ambitions that are strikingly relatable, even across centuries. Boccaccio's genius lies in his ability to capture the complexities of the human spirit, its flaws, its follies, its strengths, and its enduring capacity for both wickedness and goodness. Or those who by their quick wit escaped danger, or tales of fortune's sudden turns. This thematic approach adds a fascinating layer to the collection, allowing Boccaccio to explore the full spectrum of human experience and morality. Into this idyllic retreat, Boccaccio brings 10 young people, 7 aristocratic women, and 3 equally well-bred young men. They are not merely characters, they represent the resilience and ingenuity of humanity. They have chosen to flee the infected city, not out of cowardice, but out of a shared understanding that life must continue, that beauty and reason must be preserved. Their plan is simple, yet profound. For 10 days, they will entertain each other by telling stories. Each person will tell one story each day, culminating in 100 tales. This structure creates a sense of routine, order, and purpose, a direct counterpoint to the chaos and randomness of the plague outside. As the days unfold in the villa, we become privy to their conversations, their camaraderie, and their shared purpose. The stories themselves are a vibrant, astonishing tapestry, reflecting the full panorama of 14th century life and human nature. Through these tales, Boccaccio offers far more than mere entertainment. They serve as a powerful form of social commentary. The Decameron is also a celebration of humanism, a burgeoning philosophy that emphasized human potential and the value of earthly life. Imagine the quiet evenings in the villa as one story unfolds after another. As our time in the tranquil villa draws to a close, the echoes of the Decameron reverberate far beyond its pages, shaping not only literature but also our understanding of a pivotal historical moment. Boccaccio's masterpiece left an indelible mark, solidifying its place as a cornerstone of Western literary tradition. One of its most significant contributions lies in its linguistic innovation. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron in vernacular Italian, specifically the Florentine dialect, rather than the traditional Latin. While it doesn't entirely abandon religious themes, its primary focus is on secular life, on the joys and sorrows, the follies and triumphs of ordinary people. Boccaccio's meticulous and vivid preface provides one of the most comprehensive and chilling eyewitness accounts of the Black Death's impact on a major European city. But beyond the preface, the stories themselves offer a unique window into the social dynamics, beliefs, values, and even the anxieties of 14th century Italian society. They reveal the humor, the cynicism, the piety, and the sheer resilience of people grappling with profound change and trauma. It captures the spirit of an age, warts and all, preserving the nuances of daily life, the quirks of human relationships, and the subtle shifts in morality that occurred in the wake of such a devastating pandemic. It celebrates wit, cunning, intelligence, and the ability of individuals to navigate the world through their own faculties. The Decameron is not just a collection of old stories. It is a monument to life, a celebration of wit, and a quiet, enduring testament to the power of art to articulate, to heal, and to preserve the very essence of human experience. It reminds us that even when the world outside crumbles, the stories within us can continue to thrive, guiding us through the longest nights. This emphasis on human agency and earthly concerns, even in the shadow of divine judgment, marked a significant intellectual shift, moving away from a solely God-centered worldview towards one that recognized the value and dignity of human experience in its own right. It was a gentle but firm assertion that life on earth was worth exploring, celebrating, and understanding. Its ingenious framework narrative, a collection of diverse stories unified by a common premise, became a model for later authors. Geoffrey Chaucer, the great English poet, was profoundly inspired by Boccaccio's work, adopting elements of the Decameron structure and thematic variety for his own immortal Canterbury Tales. even centuries later. The echoes of Boccaccio's wit and narrative flair can be found in the works of writers like William Shakespeare, who drew inspiration from some of the Decameron's plots and character archetypes. Boccaccio taught writers how to tell compelling stories, how to weave together diverse narratives, and how to reveal the complexities of human nature with both humor and pathos. This was a bold and revolutionary choice at the time. By choosing the language of everyday people, he elevated Italian prose to an unprecedented level of sophistication and artistry. He demonstrated that the common tongue could be used to craft complex narratives, nuanced characterizations, and profound philosophical insights, paving the way for future Italian literary giants like Machiavelli and beyond. He effectively solidified Florentine Italian as the literary standard, contributing immeasurably to the development of the modern Italian language. Beyond language, the Decameron's literary influence was vast and far-reaching. Furthermore, the Decameron stands as a powerful testament to the rise of humanism in the medieval world. Finally, and crucially for our journey tonight, the Decameron remains an invaluable historical document. As the final echoes of Boccaccio's tales fade, we are left with a deeper understanding of how humanity, even in its darkest hours, finds light in storytelling. To truly grasp the profound disruption caused by the Black Death, we must first understand the deeply ingrained rituals and beliefs surrounding death and burial in medieval Europe. Before the Great Pestilence, death was a constant presence, a familiar companion in daily life. Infant mortality was high, famines were recurrent, and illness was common. Yet, each passing was met with a prescribed order, a series of rites that brought comfort, solace, and spiritual assurance. Imagine the medieval churchyard. It was not merely a cemetery as we conceive it today, but often a central, living space within the community. And sometimes professional lamenters or bell ringers, their mournful tolls echoing through the village or town. The destination was almost invariably the parish churchyard. Here, the grave would have been meticulously dug, often by community members, and the body reverently lowered into its individual plot. The earth would be replaced, prayers spoken over the grave, and the final blessing given. It abutted the church itself, sometimes serving as a gathering place, a market, or even a venue for public pronouncements. The wealthy might be buried within the church itself, under the floor, closer to the altar, a mark of their piety and prestige. Monasteries and convents often had their own burial grounds for their brethren and sisters, maintaining strict adherence to monastic rites. Guilds might offer burial benefits to their members, ensuring a proper send-off. Yet, regardless of class, the underlying principles remained: individual burial, consecrated ground, and the spiritual protection of the church. The graves were often marked with simple wooden crosses, sometimes with more elaborate stone effigies for the wealthy, but they were almost always individual plots. Layers of graves, sometimes disturbed to make way for new burials, would slowly build up over centuries. But this was a gradual process, managed within an established system. No one could have imagined the scale of death that was about to descend, a scale that would shatter these ancient sacred traditions and force humanity into a terrifying, unprecedented reckoning with its dead. The medieval world, rooted in order and spiritual guidance, was about to face an existential test of its capacity to bury its own. The ground was consecrated, blessed by the church, believed to be holy soil where the faithful could rest until the day of judgment. The sight of these burial mounds, unevenly scattered, would have been a constant, gentle reminder of mortality, woven into the fabric of daily life. The process of dying and burial was a communal, sacred journey. When someone fell ill, family and neighbors would gather, and then meticulously wrapped in a shroud, a simple linen cloth. Embalming was rare, reserved for royalty or high nobility. The body would then typically lie in state, perhaps in the home, for a short period, allowing family and friends to offer their final respects and begin the process of mourning. The scent of funeral flowers, herbs, and perhaps incense would have pervaded the air, an attempt to mask the inevitable odors of decay and imbue the space with sanctity. A priest would be summoned to administer the last rites, confession, anointing, and communion. This spiritual preparation was paramount, believed to cleanse the soul and prepare it for its transition from the earthly realm to the heavenly. Imagine the quiet murmur of prayers by the bedside, the flickering candlelight, the comforting presence of loved ones, even in sorrow. After death, the body would be prepared. It would be washed, often by family members or a local women's guild. The funeral procession itself was a solemn affair. The body, often carried on a bier by pallbearers, would be accompanied by a procession of mourners. Clergy, social status, of course, dictated some variations. Even before the plague, these churchyards were growing crowded, especially in bustling cities. The arrival of the Black Death in Europe in the mid-14th century marked the beginning of an unprecedented catastrophe that would not only decimate populations, but would fundamentally unravel the very fabric of society, beginning with the most intimate and sacred act, the care of the dead. The traditional systems of burial, so deeply embedded in faith and custom, simply buckled and broke under the sheer, unimaginable weight of mortality. Imagine the horror in the early days as the plague began to take hold. A family member, seemingly well one day, would be gravely ill the next, and dead within days. Then another and another. Suddenly, entire households were extinguished. The very foundation of communal life, caring for one another, especially in death, was crumbling. The usual cries of mourners were replaced by an eerie silence or the creak of burial carts. The sound of a bell, once signifying a single passing, now tolled almost ceaselessly, or ceased altogether, signifying an overwhelming, continuous death. The shock, the speed, and the sheer volume of death left communities paralyzed with fear and grief. Accounts from monastic chronicles speak of entire communities decimated, with no one left to bury the dead or even to record the names of those who perished. The neat rows of monastic graves, usually a testament to generations of brothers and sisters, were overwhelmed by desperate, improvised burials within the monastery grounds. The living could barely tend to the sick, let alone properly mourn and bury the deceased, and a desperate, futile struggle to maintain some semblance of order in the face of an unstoppable tide of death. The normal rhythms of life had not just been interrupted, they had been violently shattered, leaving behind a silence punctuated only by the sounds of suffering and the grim, urgent labor of trying to dispose of the dead before they overwhelmed the living. The medieval world was learning, in the most brutal way imaginable, how to die en masse. The collapse of established rites was swift and terrifying. Priests, monks, and nuns, those who traditionally performed the last rites and administered burials, were themselves dying at alarming rates, often on the front lines of care. Cemeteries, even large ones, filled with horrifying speed. The quiet churchyards, once places of peaceful rest, transformed into charnel houses, their consecrated ground rapidly becoming overwhelmed. There was no more space, no time for individual graves. Consider the desperate choices faced by the living. Fear of contagion became an overriding primal instinct. Touching the diseased body, even of a loved one, was seen as a direct path to one's own demise. Giovanni Boccaccio, whom we discussed previously, described how in Florence many dropped dead in the open streets, others died in their houses, having first made their condition known by the stench of their rotting bodies. He recounts how the dead were not always honored by their friends and neighbors with laments and lights and funeral masses, but were carried away by bearers hired for a small fee, who put them in the nearest open grave without any more ado. This led to agonizing decisions. Sick family members might be abandoned, left alone to die. The dead might be left unburied in their homes, their doors simply shut and marked, until someone brave or desperate enough could retrieve them. The air, already thick with the stench of sickness, now gained the horrifying, pervasive odor of unburied corpses. Chroniclers from the time paint a grim picture. This shift from sacred ritual to urgent necessity was profoundly psychologically damaging. It was a clear sign that society was breaking down. In monasteries, where communal living was the norm, the plague could be particularly devastating. Contagion spread rapidly through close quarters. This initial phase of the plague was defined by chaos, fear. As the sheer scale of the Black Death became terrifyingly clear, the desperate need to manage the dead quickly led to a chilling but necessary innovation: the systematic creation of mass graves, often referred to as plague pits. Church authorities, town councils, or simply the most desperate survivors would designate new plots of land, often on the outskirts of populated areas, specifically for mass burials. These plots had to be large enough to accommodate thousands and accessible enough for carts to transport bodies. They were often unconsecrated at first, hastily blessed after the fact due to the urgency. These were not casual burials, but rather a coordinated, albeit grim, logistical response to an unprecedented crisis. Chroniclers sometimes mentioned the specific locations of these new burial grounds, providing future archaeologists with vital clues. To handle the dead day after day, to witness the endless stream of victims, to perform this final, undignified service for so many would have been deeply traumatizing. Yet, it was a necessary task, a desperate act of communal survival to contain the overwhelming stench and the perceived threat of further contagion. These plague pits, born of crisis and necessity, became the quiet, hidden monuments to the millions who perished, awaiting their rediscovery centuries later. The earth, silently and patiently, swallowed its dead. They speak of pits filled level with the ground in a short period, requiring new ones to be dug immediately adjacent. The sheer speed at which these immense graves filled is a chilling testament to the plague's lethality. Picture immense trenches, sometimes as long as 50 meters and several meters wide and deep. The digging itself would have been a grueling, continuous task, often performed by the lowest social classes, or by those who had already contracted the disease and were simply performing a final, desperate service before their own demise. In some cities, like London or Norwich, large, specially dug pits outside the city walls became the primary burial sites. In other areas, such as rural villages, Existing churchyards might be expanded dramatically, or new, smaller communal pits dug on the edge of the village common. In particularly dense urban centers like Venice, islands were designated as quarantine and burial sites, becoming vast communal cemeteries almost overnight. The air around these sites would have been thick with the smell of death, decay, and freshly turned earth. Imagine the planning, if it can even be called that, for such an undertaking. The construction of these pits was a monumental and dangerous undertaking. Bodies would be brought to these pits, often on carts, sometimes in improvised shrouds, sometimes naked. The process of interring them was one of grim efficiency. Bodies would be placed side by side or head to toe, often in layers separated by thin coverings of earth or lime, which was believed to disinfect or contain the contagion. Imagine the quiet horror of workers descending into the pit, carefully or sometimes hastily, arranging the dead before more bodies were lowered in on top of them. The goal was simply to get the bodies underground as quickly as possible, to prevent further spread of disease and to make space for the ever-increasing number of dead. There were regional variations in how this crisis was managed. Historical records, though sparse for such chaotic times, offer glimpses. The psychological toll on those involved in this process must have been immense. For centuries, these vast plague pits lay undisturbed, forgotten beneath the accumulating layers of time, quietly holding their grim secrets. Their existence was sometimes noted in obscure historical documents or local folklore, but for the most part, they remained hidden. It wasn't until the relentless march of urban development in the 20th and 21st centuries, or the dedicated work of historical archaeology, that these silent witnesses began to emerge from their long slumber. In Florence, Italy, excavations beneath modern streets have unearthed multiple mass burial sites from the 1348 plague, revealing the devastating impact on that vibrant city. It demands immense patience and precision. Imagine the quiet concentration of an archaeologist gently brushing away millennia of earth, carefully exposing the fragile outline of a skeleton. Every bone, every artifact, every subtle variation in the soil is meticulously documented, photographed, and mapped in 3 dimensions before being carefully removed. The goal is to extract every possible piece of information to reconstruct the stories that these silent witnesses have to tell. Not just about their deaths, but about their lives. On the island of Lazaretto Vecchio, near Venice, which served as a quarantine, for instance, faint horizontal lines on the long bones, known as Harris lines, indicate periods of arrested growth, often caused by severe malnutrition or acute illness during childhood. Robust muscle attachments on bones can indicate a life of heavy physical labor. Healed fractures, though not necessarily plague-related, reveal the common accidents and injuries of medieval life. Signs of common degenerative diseases, such as arthritis in the joints, speak to the daily wear and tear on bodies engaged in demanding agricultural work or urban crafts. In some cases, evidence of specific infectious diseases other than plague might be found, such as tuberculosis or leprosy, which can leave characteristic marks on bone if the individual lived with the disease for an extended period. This provides a broader picture of the health landscape of the era. Similarly, defects in tooth enamel, called enamel hypoplasia, point to periods of nutritional stress or disease during the years of tooth formation, their bodies weakened by previous hardship, making them potentially more vulnerable to disease. Imagine the quiet hum of sophisticated equipment, the careful handling of fragile ancient remains under microscopes, and the focused concentration of scientists working to extract the most minute fragments of information. Each bone, each tooth becomes a piece of a larger, collective biography of a population brought to its knees by an invisible foe. It is in this quiet, dedicated study, where the scientific method meets the human story, that the silent whispers of the plague victims truly begin to resonate, revealing the intimate details of lives lost and the stark realities of their world. It speaks of a population brought to its knees, struggling with the most basic act of dignified farewell, even when those lives ended in anonymity within a mass grave. However, this is where the quiet science becomes even more precise. The preservation of microbial DNA within the bones and teeth of these victims has unlocked a new dimension of understanding, allowing us to move beyond mere inference. These scientists are not just looking at skeletons. These silent witnesses, unearthed from their long slumber, provide invaluable, tangible evidence of history's darkest moments, waiting patiently for us to decipher their quiet, profound messages. Their presence beneath our feet is a constant, quiet reminder of the resilience and the fragility of life and burial ground during later plague outbreaks. Vast numbers of remains have been found, some showing signs of hasty, desperate interment. In Terne, Belgium, a medieval cemetery revealed unusual pits specifically for plague victims, often with lime used as a disinfectant, and mastoid process, and particularly the pelvis. Scientists can estimate the sex of the individuals, the eruption and wear patterns of teeth. From this data, a chilling picture emerges. Plague pits reveal an indiscriminate killer. Unlike diseases that might primarily target the very young or the elderly, the Black Death often struck down people of all ages, including a significant proportion of young adults in the prime of their lives. This confirms historical accounts of massive population collapse and helps us understand who was lost and the sheer, devastating impact on the overall demographic structure of medieval society. Each site presents its own challenges, varying soil conditions affecting preservation or layers of later disturbance, but all contribute to a growing body of evidence. Imagine the moment of discovery. It rarely happens with dramatic fanfare, but rather with a quiet, almost reverent awe. A construction crew digging foundations for a new building, or archaeologists conducting a planned excavation in an old city quarter, might suddenly encounter not just a few scattered bones, but a dense, packed layer of human remains. The sight is unmistakable. Bodies arranged in tight rows, or sometimes haphazardly tumbled together, clearly signaling a mass burial event rather than individual graves. One of the most famous and extensively studied sites is the East Smithfield mass grave in London, first fully excavated during the construction of the Royal Mint in the late 1980s. Picture the scene. A vast trench, extending for some 50 meters, revealed layer after layer of human skeletons. The meticulous work of the archaeologists involved carefully scraping away the soil, using trowels and brushes to expose each bone, each body. They noted the exact position of every skeleton, the orientation of limbs, the presence of any accompanying artifacts. The sheer density of burials was staggering. Over 700 individuals identified within just one portion of the pit, suggesting that the entire burial ground held thousands more. Similar discoveries have been made across Europe, each offering unique insights. The archaeological process itself is a slow, meticulous act of revelation. The initial observation in the field, the sheer number of bodies, their often haphazard positioning, the absence of individual coffins or elaborate grave goods, immediately tells a story of overwhelming crisis. Once unearthed and carefully transported from the field, the skeletal remains from plague pits embark on a new phase of their journey. The quiet, meticulous analysis in the specialized laboratories of forensic anthropology and paleopathology. One of the primary objectives is demographic reconstruction. By carefully examining features of the skull, such as the brow ridge, beyond basic demographics, the bones offer profound insights into the general health and living conditions of the medieval population before they succumbed to the plague. The bones can also tell us about physical activity and trauma. While Yersinia pestis itself does not leave direct identifiable marks on bone, the context of the mass burial itself is the primary and powerful indicator of plague death. The transition from the meticulous archaeological excavation to the precise laboratory analysis is a fascinating and often humbling one. For centuries, while the horror of the Black Death was undeniable, the precise identity of its microbial culprit remained a subject of intense historical and scientific debate. Was it truly the bubonic plague caused by Yersinia pestis, or perhaps a viral pandemic, or even a different bacterial agent? Scientists meticulously clean and sterilize tiny samples, often just a few milligrams of bone or, most crucially, the dental pulp, from within the teeth of presumed plague victims. Teeth are remarkable preservers of DNA because the hard enamel acts as a robust protective capsule, shielding the delicate genetic material from degradation over hundreds of years, even millennia. Once extracted, this precious ancient DNA is then subjected to highly sensitive amplification techniques, like polymerase chain reaction, and then sequenced. While Yersinia pestis still exists today, some research suggests that the medieval strain may have been a distinct variant, or that the environmental conditions and population densities of the 14th century allowed for different, more devastating transmission dynamics than those seen in more recent outbreaks. The debate continues, for example, about the prevalence of pneumonic transmission during the Black Death, which is less common in modern outbreaks, but would explain its terrifying speed. The ancient DNA allows scientists to explore these nuances, adding intricate layers to our understanding. This sequence is then compared to known genetic sequences of modern pathogens. These are not just archaeological sites, they are mass graves of human beings who suffered immensely. The work requires immense respect for the deceased, careful and dignified handling of remains, and thoughtful consideration of how discoveries are presented to the public. The aim is always to honor the memory of the victims by using scientific inquiry to shed light on their lives and deaths, to give voice to those who could not speak rather than to sensationalize their suffering. This delicate balance between scientific rigor and profound human empathy is central to paleopathological and paleogenetic research. This profound historical mystery lay patiently waiting for its answer within the very bones entombed in the plague pits. With every new discovery, every advancement in ancient DNA technology, more precise questions can be asked, and more nuanced answers can be gently coaxed from the silent earth. What were the specific genetic vulnerabilities or strengths within medieval populations? How did the constant presence of Yersinia pestis impact human evolution? These hidden truths, slowly revealed by the painstaking work of archaeologists and scientists, continue to inform our understanding of disease, demographics, and the extraordinary resilience of humanity in the face of unimaginable catastrophe. These sites are not merely places of death. They are enduring monuments to lives lived and to the quiet, determined efforts of those who seek to understand and remember. Seminal studies from multiple plague pits across Europe, notably the pioneering work on the East Smithfield grave in London by researchers like Dr. Kirsten Boss and Dr. Johannes Kraus. Further phylogenetic analysis, the study of evolutionary relationships among biological entities of these ancient Yersinia pestis strains, has opened new windows into the evolution and spread of the pathogen itself. By comparing the genetic signatures of the medieval bacterium to modern strains found in different parts of the world, scientists can trace its likely geographical origin, its migratory pathways across continents, and even identify specific ancestral strains. This has contributed to the understanding that the Black Death likely originated in Central Asia before spreading west, definitively confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for modern bubonic, pneumonic, and septicemic plague. This was a monumental achievement, settling a long-standing historical debate and providing irrefutable scientific proof of the Black Death's cause. The genetic fingerprint left in those ancient teeth echoed across 7 centuries, finally identifying the unseen killer. It took the advent of a revolutionary scientific field, paleogenetics, the study of ancient DNA, to finally unveil the unequivocal truth. Imagine the painstaking process that unfolds in specialized laboratories. The breakthrough came with overwhelming clarity and precision, but the revelations didn't stop there. These studies also offer insights into the virulence and characteristics of the medieval plague. The study of plague pits and the remarkable scientific breakthroughs they've enabled also carries profound ethical considerations. The legacy of the plague pits continues to unfold, revealing layer after layer of quiet truth. To truly grasp the magnitude of the shifts that followed the Black Death, we must first settle ourselves firmly within the established order of medieval Europe, particularly its prevailing socio-economic system, feudalism. This was not merely a political structure, but a deeply ingrained way of life, dictating social relationships, economic activity, and personal liberties. Imagine a vast, intricate pyramid. At its apex sat the monarch, theoretically owning all the land. Below the king were the great lords, dukes, counts, barons, who held their land, or fiefs, from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. These lords, in turn, granted land to lesser nobles, knights, and vassals, who owed them similar services. This created a complex web of mutual obligations, loyalty, and military support, extending downwards. Their homes were typically simple, one-room huts shared with their animals. The prospect of moving up the social ladder was a dream rarely, if ever, realized. This static nature was a defining characteristic of feudal society, designed to maintain order and control, ensuring a stable labor force for the landowning elite. The economic system was largely subsistence-based, with limited surplus and little incentive for innovation. This was a world of fixed relationships, deeply rooted in tradition, unaware of the immense, silent forces that were about to shatter its very foundations. This intricate, unchanging web of obligations and traditions defined the life of the vast majority. A world seemingly immutable, awaiting an unimaginable disruption. Diet was often monotonous, based on grains and legumes. Disease was common, and life expectancy was low. Yet, within this rigid system, there was also a degree of stability and a sense of belonging. The Lord offered protection from external threats. The Church provided spiritual comfort and community. But for the vast majority of the population, perhaps 85% to 90%, life was lived at the very base of this pyramid, within the system known as manorialism. The manor was the fundamental economic and social unit. It consisted of a lord's domain, his private lands, and the surrounding lands worked by peasants. This was not slavery in the classical sense, but a condition of unfreedom. Their waking hours were often dictated by the sun. They would spend days plowing the Lord's domain, planting his crops, harvesting his grain, and mending his fences. In addition to labor services, they often paid dues in kind, a portion of their own harvest, eggs, chickens, or cheese. They might also pay monetary rents, though money was scarce in the early medieval period. They relied on the Lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, and his forest for firewood, each service requiring a fee or additional labor. Serfs were, quite literally, tied to the land. They could not leave the manor without the Lord's permission, nor could they marry without his consent. In exchange for the Lord's protection and a plot of land to farm for their own sustenance, serfs owed various obligations. Their lives were a continuous cycle of labor and dues. The entire manor was largely self-sufficient, producing most of what its inhabitants needed. The rhythm of life here was slow, dictated by the turning of the seasons, the sun, and the agricultural cycle. The central figure in the daily life of the manor was the serf. Imagine the daily routine of a serf. Life for the serf was one of grinding poverty and relentless toil. Social mobility was almost non-existent. You were born into your station, and you largely remained there. The carefully constructed world of feudalism, described in our previous segment, was predicated on one fundamental resource: human labor. The fields needed tending, the sheep needed herding, the crafts needed making. The sheer scale of demographic collapse was unprecedented. This was not a gradual decline. It was a sudden, violent, and pervasive loss of human life. The fields that once buzzed with activity suddenly lay silent. Workshops in towns stood empty. Inns were devoid of travelers, and market stalls remained untended. A large, relatively stable population was the engine of the medieval economy. Before the plague, labor was abundant, cheap, and easily exploited. Land, though owned by the lords, was only valuable if it could be worked. Now the tables were turned. Land was plentiful, abandoned by the dead, but human labor was scarce and precious. There were simply not enough hands to work the land. This basic principle of economics, applied with brutal force by the plague, meant that the value of human work began to rise dramatically. The old certainties of the feudal system, built on a surplus of labor, were suddenly undone. This demographic catastrophe, though devastating in its human toll, inadvertently became the quiet catalyst for a massive redistribution of economic power, setting the stage for surprising changes that would slowly but surely reshape the medieval world. The harvest of death had paradoxically begun to sow the seeds of a new social order. Wages, which had been stagnant for centuries, started to climb. Rents, which lords traditionally collected from their peasants, began to fall, as lords struggled to find anyone to work their fields, even for a reduced price. In rural areas, vast tracts of arable land lay fallow, overgrown with weeds, simply because there were no surviving peasants to sow or harvest. Imagine a baker's shop, its oven cold because the baker and his family had succumbed, or a construction site for a cathedral, now eerily silent, its stonemasons and laborers gone. Services also suffered. Laundresses, porters, domestic servants, all were scarce. The urban economy, while more dynamic than the rural, was equally dependent on human capital, and that capital had been tragically depleted. Livestock wandered untended or perished from neglect. The intricate agricultural cycle, which sustained the entire society, was thrown into utter disarray. But then, the Black Death swept across the continent, and with its devastating mortality, it unleashed an economic earthquake, the likes of which Europe had never seen. Imagine the initial impact. Within months, sometimes weeks, a third, a half, or even more of the population simply vanished. The most immediate and profound economic consequence was a catastrophic labor famine. Consider the ripple effects across various sectors. In the countryside, mills that ground grain stood idle for lack of someone to operate them, or grain to grind. Breweries ceased production. Foresters were too few to manage woodlands. The basic necessities of life, which had always been produced through sheer human effort, suddenly faced critical bottlenecks. In urban centers, the impact was equally devastating. Guilds, which regulated crafts from weaving to shoemaking to carpentry, lost enormous numbers of their skilled masters and apprentices. This severe labor shortage created an immediate and fundamental shift in the relationship between labor and capital. The economic reality was stark. Demand for labor skyrocketed, while its supply plummeted. The immediate aftermath of the Black Death was not just a period of mourning and fear, but one of profound economic shock and revaluation. From the crucible of the labor famine emerged an unexpected and revolutionary phenomenon. The surviving peasantry gained unprecedented leverage. The quiet, unspoken power dynamics of feudalism, which had kept them subservient for centuries, began to shift. The constant demand for labor gave the common people a voice they had never truly possessed before. Imagine a lord, his fields lying fallow, his crops rotting, his rents plummeting because there were no peasants left to work his land. He had two choices: let his estate fall into ruin or make concessions. And for the first time, it was the peasants who held the stronger hand. One of the most immediate and impactful changes was the rise in wages. With so few laborers, those who survived could demand significantly higher pay for their work, whether in the fields, in the towns, or in specialized crafts. Historical records show wage increases of 50%, 100%, or even more in many regions. Imagine a peasant who had always lived at subsistence level, suddenly earning enough to buy better food, better clothing, or even small luxuries they could only have dreamed of before. This increased purchasing power brought a tangible improvement to their daily lives. Beyond wages, the Black Death facilitated a profound shift in land tenure. Before the plague, serfs were tied to the land, their plots often held at the lord's will, with heavy labor services owed. Now, with so much land abandoned, lords were desperate to find anyone to cultivate it. This led to new forms of contracts, often more favorable to the tenant. Copyhold tenure became more common, where peasants held land by a copy of the manorial court roll, granting them greater security and heritable rights to their plots, rather than being mere tenants at. In some areas, freehold tenure, where peasants fully owned their land, expanded, giving them true independence. A crucial development was the commutation of labor services. Traditionally, serfs owed days of work on the lord's domain, but now, with labor so scarce, lords found it more efficient to accept money payments instead of labor. Imagine a peasant, instead of spending 3 days a week toiling on the lord's fields, now paying a fixed rent and having all their time free to work their own plot or to hire themselves out for wages. This shift freed up immense amounts of peasant time and energy, allowing them to accumulate wealth and gain greater autonomy over their lives. Perhaps the most radical assertion of newfound freedom was the ability to move. Before the plague, a serf who fled the manor was a fugitive, easily caught and returned. But now, if a lord treated his peasants too harshly, they could simply pack their meager belongings and seek opportunities on another manor, where a desperate lord might offer far better terms, or even a town where demand for labor in crafts and services was high. The constant threat of peasants abandoning their holdings was a powerful bargaining chip that lords had never faced before. This unprecedented ability to negotiate, to earn more, to gain more secure land tenure, and to move, fundamentally altered the relationship between the lord and the peasant. The chains of feudalism, while not entirely broken, were significantly loosened. The common people, who had suffered so terribly, began to experience a quiet but profound rise in their economic and social standing. A surprising outcome from the darkest of times. Their resilience and their newfound bargaining power were slowly, patiently reshaping the very contours of medieval society. Asterisk, asterisk, the shift in power from the landowning elite to the laboring masses did not go unchallenged. The nobility, accustomed to centuries of unchallenged authority and a ready supply of cheap labor, viewed these changes with alarm and often outright hostility. Their wealth, their status, and their very way of life were predicated on the old feudal order, and they were determined to resist its unraveling. Imagine the lords, seeing their lands lie fallow, their rents diminishing, and their former serfs demanding higher wages or even freedom. Their initial response was often one of denial and an attempt to reassert control through legal and social means. They believed that these new demands were an affront to the established order, a challenge to the divinely ordained hierarchy. One of the most significant attempts to curb peasant demands came from the authorities themselves, often at the behest of the landowning class. In England, for instance, King Edward III issued the Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, quickly followed by the more comprehensive Statute of Labourers in 1351. These laws attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels, make it illegal for peasants to move from their manors in search of better terms, and punish those who demanded higher pay or refused to work. Similar legislation was enacted across various European kingdoms, from France to Aragon, but these laws were largely ineffective. Imagine the futility of trying to legislate against the forces of supply and demand on such a vast scale, with so few laborers who would enforce these laws, who would work for lower wages when higher ones were available just a few miles away. Many lords themselves desperate for labor, would simply ignore the laws and pay higher wages anyway, undercutting the very system they theoretically supported. The laws created resentment, but rarely stemmed the tide of economic change. This resentment, combined with continued attempts by some lords to enforce old feudal obligations or even increase burdens on their remaining tenants, eventually boiled over into widespread unrest. The late 14th century saw a series of major peasant revolts across Europe, direct responses to the tensions created by the post-plague economic and social shifts. One of the most famous was the Jacquerie in France in 1358. Imagine the fury of peasants starved, exploited, and burdened by war, rising up against their lords in a violent, desperate spasm of rebellion. Though brutally suppressed, it sent a clear message to the nobility about the depth of peasant discontent. Even more significant was Wat Tyler's rebellion in England in 1381. Picture thousands of angry peasants, artisans, and disillusioned soldiers marching on London, demanding an end to serfdom, lower taxes, and greater freedom. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by radical preachers like John Ball, they confronted the young King Richard II, briefly holding the city and making demands for a new social order. Though this rebellion too was ultimately crushed and its leaders executed, its impact was profound. It demonstrated the peasantry's new awareness of their collective power and their willingness to fight for their rights. The rebellion sent a powerful shockwave through the ruling elite, ultimately leading to a more cautious approach to peasant demands and contributing to the gradual decline of serfdom in England. These revolts, though often short-lived and violently suppressed, were not failures. They were powerful expressions of the new bargaining power of the common people. They demonstrated that the peasantry would no longer accept their traditional subservience without question. The nobility, while maintaining their power, had to acknowledge that the old ways were unsustainable. The resistance from above, though forceful, ultimately failed to stem the tide of profound social and economic change that the Black Death had unleashed from below. The silent pressure of demographic change was proving more powerful than any law or army. The pressures of labor shortage and peasant demands, combined with the often futile attempts by the nobility to resist change, slowly but surely began to reshape the very landscape of land ownership and agricultural practice across Western Europe. This was a gradual process, spanning decades, but its cumulative effect was profound. The slow decline of the traditional manorial system and the rise of a more independent, often landowning peasantry. Imagine the vast estates of the great lords, many of whom found it increasingly difficult to profit from their domain lands. The portions of the manor they traditionally farmed directly using serf labor, with labor costs soaring and traditional services impossible to enforce, rather than attempting to cultivate them themselves. This shift moved them away from direct agricultural management and towards simply being landlords. This created opportunities for surviving peasants, those who had managed to accumulate some wealth from higher wages, or who had secured more favorable tenancy agreements, now had the chance to expand their holdings. They might lease additional plots, or even purchase abandoned lands from struggling lords. This led to the emergence of a new, vital social class, the yeoman farmer, A yeoman was typically a free man who owned and worked his own land. They were independent, economically stable, and often served as pillars of their local communities. Imagine a yeoman farmer cultivating his own fields, making his own decisions about planting and harvesting, his future largely determined by his own hard work and market conditions, rather than by the whims of a feudal lord. This was a stark contrast to the previous generations of serfs. The rise of the yeomanry contributed to the decline of communal farming practices in some areas. Before the plague, many manors practiced open-field farming, where strips of land were intermingled and communal decisions were made about planting and harvesting. As individual peasants gained more control over their plots, and as land became more available, more efficient agricultural methods, the long-term economic consequences were significant. The increased economic power of the peasantry stimulated rural economies and towns, creating a more vibrant and interconnected economy. The increased productivity of more independent farmers, motivated by their own profit rather than forced labor. The quiet shift in land ownership and labor relations slowly but surely transformed the rural landscape. Incentives and the growing independence of the common person, the chains of feudalism, once so strong, were loosening, not with a sudden clang, but with the quiet, persistent pressure of a changed demographic reality, ushering in a new era for the very ground upon which society was built. The profound shifts unleashed by the Black Death were not confined to the rural landscape. They also reshaped urban centers and, perhaps most strikingly, led to a significant divergence in the social and economic trajectories of Western and Eastern Europe. In the towns and cities, the immediate impact of the plague was devastating, as we've discussed. But for those who survived, the long-term effects were often beneficial. Controlled urban production and trade saw their ranks thinned, making it easier for new members to join and establish themselves. This contributed to a more fluid social structure within towns, allowing for greater social mobility for skilled artisans and merchants. The influx of rural populations seeking better opportunities in the towns also fueled urban growth in the generations following the plague. These new arrivals, no longer bound by strict feudal ties, contributed to the expansion of urban industries and trade for manufactured goods, further boosting urban economies. Cities, though deeply scarred, eventually emerged from the plague stronger and more dynamic, becoming centers of innovation and wealth accumulation that would eventually challenge the power of the landed aristocracy. However, the impact of the Black Death was not uniform across the entire continent. It led to a crucial divergence between Western and Eastern Europe in terms of the fate of serf. In Western Europe, including England, France, Italy, and parts of Germany, the labor shortage led, as we've explored, to the gradual decline of serfdom. Lords found it increasingly difficult to enforce labor services or prevent peasants from leaving. They often had to commute services into money rents, which, over time, diminished the personal unfreedom of the peasants. The economic realities forced a transition towards a more free labor market and a system of money-based rents and wages. By the end of the 15th century, serfdom had largely faded from Western Europe, replaced by tenant farming and wage labor. This laid the groundwork for the eventual development of early capitalism and a more dynamic, market-driven economy. But in Eastern Europe, encompassing regions like Prussia, Poland, and parts of Russia, the story took a dramatically different turn. Historians point to several factors. Eastern Europe's populations were generally less dense, and its towns were less powerful. The nobility, facing the same labor shortages, had more unchecked political power and less competition from urban centers. They were able to use their political authority to force peasants back into stricter forms of serfdom, tying them more firmly to the land and demanding more labor services. To ensure their profits, they needed a captive labor force. Imagine the stark contrast: a peasant in England, gradually gaining more freedom and economic opportunity, able to choose where to work and negotiate wages, and across the Elbe River. In Eastern Europe, a peasant might find their freedoms shrinking. This divergence laid the foundation for profound social and economic differences between the two halves of the continent for centuries to come. In conclusion, powerful catalyst for immense social and economic transformation, it shattered rigid structures, empowered the common person, and set different regions on divergent paths. The quiet, persistent forces unleashed by this demographic catastrophe ultimately reshaped the medieval world, ushering in a new era marked by greater individual freedom, changed relationships to land, and the slow. Its echoes continue to inform our understanding of the delicate balance between human life and societal change.